Some employees didn't leave the organization, they didn't leave their job, they left you. I think a lot of leaders blame things like compensation for turnover because it protects them from asking harder questions. Well, they'll say, well, they got a better offer, they wanted more flexibility, they wanted a better commute, better work life balance, they wanted more money. There's usually another question underneath those explanations that leaders avoid sitting with long enough. What was it actually like to work around me before they left? Not what I intended, not what I thought I was creating. What did people genuinely experience around me? That's an uncomfortable question for almost every leader if they were to answer it truthfully. There's a quote by Chester Barnard: "The ultimate authority in an organization rests with those who accept it." And that's a heavier statement than it first sounds. You see, leadership isn't something that people just accept because the org chart says that they should. See, people are quietly deciding whether or not they trust you, whether or not they are buying into you long before they decide whether or not to trust your title. Sometimes people stop choosing your leadership months before they decide to resign. One of the biggest mistakes leaders make is assuming that employees leave suddenly, because most don't. Usually they've checked out before they've decided to leave. They still show up. They still answer emails. They still sit through meetings. Something changes. Maybe they stop speaking up. Maybe they stop volunteering ideas. Maybe someone who's always striving to make things better stops challenging things. I've sat in meetings where somebody who used to challenge ideas, to push, suddenly it just stopped. It wasn't because they suddenly agreed with everything. I think they stopped believing that honesty was worth the risk. Looking back, I can think of moments early in my career where I probably missed those signals myself. And once that happens, the resignation usually isn't the beginning of the problem. It's the formal acknowledgement of something that happened months earlier. See, people don't leave because of just one interaction. Usually it's a slow accumulation of moments. Moments that change how people experience themselves around someone. Organizations often miss that part. We love to measure things. We love things we can count. Compensation, benefits, schedules, workload. Those things, they all matter. And according to Pew Research survey, people cited multiple reasons for leaving. The two most popular were low pay and lack of growth. But coupled with those two reasons, over 70% of the time, people also cited feeling disrespected and feeling unseen. See, by the time people leave, frustration is usually layered. There's an operational component, but then there's a relational component. Eventually, people just feel done. Organizations spend enormous amounts of money trying to solve retention issues, but they refuse to examine the environments people are trying to get away from in the first place. See, salary data fits neatly into a dashboard, but the relational impact that leaders have on people around them, that's harder to quantify. You can track comp, you can track those things, it trends pretty easily, but it's much harder to measure the exhaustion that people may feel because of the interaction with a certain type of leader. You can feel it when the room gets tighter, when people become careful, less open, less honest. Most people who've spent enough time inside organizations probably have. Eventually, people just stop choosing that environment, not always because of the work. Usually, it's not because of the work. Sometimes because of what the work starts to feel like attached to certain people. It's easier to say they left for more money than to ask, did they stop feeling valued before they started looking elsewhere? That's a much more uncomfortable conversation. The discussion stops being about market conditions, about external conditions, and it becomes about presence, about tone, reactions, the emotional atmosphere people work inside every day. See, organizations are constantly rolling out engagement initiatives, retention programs, employee surveys, all while employees are warning each other which leaders to avoid. That should concern leaders more than it does sometimes. See, culture doesn't collapse dramatically, it's a slow erosion. And most of the time, it deteriorates relational first. I've worked around incredibly intelligent, brilliant people, intelligent executives who could explain strategy, market growth, financial performance down to the most minute detail. But you could feel the room energy change when they walked in. Nobody wanted to share bad news. Nobody wanted to challenge ideas. Nobody wanted to speak up. People became very careful. They weren't being honest. And see, the dangerous part is some of those leaders genuinely believe they were strong leaders because the organization that kept rewarding them for the outcomes around them. If I'm being fair, I think most leaders can drift into that without realizing it. Success, it has a way of reducing self-examination if you're not careful. And I think that's one of the most dangerous dynamics that organizations can normalize, rewarding results while ignoring the relational damage that surround those results. A person can look wildly successful on paper, but the people around them, exhausted and worn out. Eventually, people begin withdrawing from the culture itself, not loudly, usually quietly. Less honesty, less engagement. People still show up, but it's different. One of the most dangerous things that can happen to somebody in authority is becoming operationally successful while quietly damaging people relationally. I've seen leaders hit every metric they were asked to hit, every target, while trust around them slowly deteriorated. The organization tolerated it because the numbers looked good, but eventually the costs surfaced somewhere. Turnover, silence, burnout, disengagement. People can suppress what they really think for a while, but relational exhaustion eventually shows up somewhere in the system. And I think a lot of leaders, myself included at times, underestimate the emotional weight they carry into a room. Most people don't leave because of one catastrophic moment. Usually it's an erosion. It's 100 conversations, 100 meetings, 100 reactions, 100 moments where people slowly stop feeling uncomfortable being fully honest. That's why I don't think retention is primarily an HR issue. I think it's a human issue that leadership is the influence behind. Before somebody says, well, employees are responsible for themselves too, well, of course they are. Not every resignation is the leader's fault, but leaders are still responsible for the environment that people repeatedly experience before they leave. And that responsibility exists whether the leader fully acknowledges it or not. I think a lot of people in authority, they never examine themselves deeply enough to understand the effect they have on others. Because self-awareness, it's harder than strategy. It's a lot harder. The longer I've worked around organizations, the more I think people overcomplicate leadership. It's all about how do people become around you? Are they more honest or more guarded? Are they more thoughtful or more careful? That question alone reveals a lot. People don't become guarded for no reason. Sometimes leaders think that employees are intimidated by their high expectations, when really employees are just exhausted by the unpredictability. They're spending energy trying to manage the leader's reactions instead of focusing on the actual work. I've had moments over the years where I've had to ask myself whether people feel comfortable being fully honest around me or whether they were managing my reactions too. See, most leaders need to wrestle with that question occasionally. Once a team starts to emotionally manage the leader, instead of solving problems together, the culture is deteriorating. Proverbs 27, verse 23 says, "Be sure to know the condition of your flocks." I think a lot of leaders know the condition of their metrics far better than they know the condition of their people. Eventually, that disconnect is going to catch up with organizations. People are much more forgiving of imperfect leadership than they are of detached leadership. People don't need their leaders to be flawless. They need leaders who can stay human when conversations become uncomfortable. People remember leaders who can stay open when conversations become difficult. That stays with people. A leader who listens, a leader who apologizes, a leader who can hear the difficult feedback without trying to punish or get defensive. That kind of presence, it builds trust over time in ways that spreadsheets they'll never fully capture. People don't need their leaders to be perfect. They do need leaders who make honesty feel safe. I think that's rarer inside organizations than many people realize. Some employees absolutely leave for better opportunities, but sometimes that better opportunity is simply no longer feeling emotionally drained by certain leadership dynamics. And people will tolerate difficult work for a surprisingly long time. What wears people down faster is constantly feeling managed emotionally instead of led relationally. At Humble Executive, this is really the conversation. It's not just performance, it's presence. It's not just outcomes, it's what people slowly become around you. People will always have reasons for leaving jobs. More money, different opportunities, different seasons of life. But leaders still owe themselves the honesty of asking a harder question before they explain every resignation away. What was it actually like to work around me before they left?